I asked 100 leading Christian apologists what they think is the best argument for the existence of God.
You know, morons.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plink. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. You know, in the ideological battle between believers and non-believers, religious apologists are just in a continuingly losing battle. Rates of non-belief, either by way of atheism, or secular living, or just general agnosticism, or any of the other myriad of ways that non-belief can be broken into different categories so that apologists can pretend that none of their numbers are very high, well, they're all growing, and when all collected together, reveal the dying trend of religiosity in the Western world. So, on the debate stage, apologists are a losing class backing a losing pony. Not to mention that none of them have come up with any kind of new argument for their spiritual belief system or their preferred deity in over 100 years, it seems. So, it's no surprise that Sean McDowell has realized the folly of his position and is attempting to stack the proverbial deck here today and is collecting all the best arguments from 100 of the top apologists in the game of religious grifting in the hopes that sheer numbers will overwhelm any pushback, banking on quantity of arguments over quality of arguments. And I mean, we can hardly blame him for that. When one only has religious apologetic arguments at their disposal, quality arguments have really gone bye-bye. So, I thought today it would be fun for this little atheistic cycloptic tribble to forego my usual shtick of taking on just one apologist, and instead letting the legion of liturgical lunkheads line up to get laid out. So let's let Sean crack on with the top arguments for God from the top proselytizers in the business. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, who knows that respecting rights, responsible relations require rigorous research, reason reigns, rejecting religious rituals, rational realities remain, rendering revelations redundant. Reaching real reforms requires recognizing reality rather than repeating rote recitations. May keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
I asked 100 leading Christian apologists what they think is the best argument for the existence of God. William Lane Craig, Wes Huff, Nancy Pearcey, Alan Parr, Trent Horn, Stuart Connectly, and more.
Well, gadzooks! It's a veritable who's who of religious malarkey. Low Bar Bill? Stuart, I'm riding my daddy's coattails Connectly? Alan 10 swings and misses on a par 4? I see we're going for the absolute creme de la creme here. Some other fun ones I saw on the list include J. Warner Wallace, Greg Koukl, Mike Winger, Tim Barnett. Strangely absent, though, was Frank Turek. Oh well, can't catch 'em all, I guess. But the funniest part was that a full third of this list was anonymous Talbot School of Theology professor. These are all people from Biola University, the Christian college where Sean works. Because I guess when you can't get the numbers you need, just email all your work buddies and list them anonymously so you can hit your 100 goal. But I digress. What did these great thinkers of theology have to say, Sean?
Let's start with the smallest category, which I've dubbed existential. These are kind of personal encounters or experiences with God. So for example, this is one that surprised me. The great John Lennox said a transformed life he considers the best evidence for the existence of God. By transformed life, we mean somebody whose life is broken in some sense and then is transformed by Jesus.
It's funny to me that the least cited, least mentioned argument for God is the one that I would probably deem the strongest one that apologists have. Or at least the one that is the hardest to argue against. Because a personal experience or personal encounter that a person believes to have been real, and a real encounter with a real God, well, that's something that is difficult to convince that person didn't happen, or that they are maybe misinterpreting whatever did happen. After all, I wasn't there. I didn't experience what they experienced. So how can I say definitively that it didn't happen exactly the way they claim to remember it? Fortunately, personal experience or encounters is also the least convincing to anyone else, and is only anecdotal evidence that likely won't go beyond the person who claims it happened to them. Because to anyone hearing their account, saying something like, "Oh, I saw God, I stood in His presence, I felt His divine love for myself," well, they're just going to come across as someone who had a dream or a hallucination at best, and as a lying grifter trying to sell them something at worst. And as far as Lennox's claim that a transformed life is the best argument for God's existence, why? Because some addicts joined a religious-based 12-step program and got clean? Or some criminals turned to religion while in jail and straightened up and flew right from that point on? Well then, what about all the addicts who got clean through secular recovery programs? What about all the people who changed their lives without appealing to a god or religion in order to do so? What about the large and growing larger contingent of people who change their lives for the better in the opposite direction? One-time religious zealots who lost their faith and transformed their lives by becoming non-believers. Like, for instance, Megan Phelps Roper, former member of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church and granddaughter of its founder, Fred Phelps. Now an irreligious, secular, anti-religious extremism activist who practically any decent person's conception has become an immensely better person than the religious bigot she was brought up as, and owes that growth and that transformed life to leaving her Christian religion and faith. The reality is that lives transform whenever a person realizes that their life is unfulfilling, and the cognitive dissonance that they are living with and experiencing day after day has just become too much to continue to bear. This is why deconversion away from religion is so prevalent, with Pew Research finding that 34% of people who grew up Christian will discard their religion by the time they turn 30, including 3% who switch to a non-Christian religion and 31% who identify with no religion. And among some older cohorts of Christians, 7% will leave at a later age. So 40 or so percent of people raised Christian will eventually leave it. What does that kind of transformed life indicate? When you're leaning into the idea that believing in God allows people to change their lives as proof of God's existence, what does it prove when people are making similar changes to their lives, specifically by ending their belief in God? Perhaps it just shows that the only thing that is required to transform one's life is the desire and conviction to do so, not literal divine intervention.
The next category, I dubbed this one unique arguments. So these are arguments that one or two people held, and I kind of lumped them together. So J. Steve Miller, if you follow this channel, you'll recognize I've had him on a bunch of times to talk about near-death experiences. He's the only one that cited near-death experiences.
There's a reason for that. He's batshit crazy.
Near-death experiences are one of the most laughably stupid attempts at establishing the existence of a god, and for a number of reasons. For one, the same problem with the last line of thinking applies here as well. It's all anecdotal. It's convincing to exactly one person, the person who had it. Secondly, NDEs have basically become the old wives' tale of the apologist grab bag of arguments, with people who propagate them spinning yarns about, oh, this person died on the table, and when they were revived, they claimed to have seen things and heard things that they couldn't possibly have, like what was going on in other rooms of the hospital, or seeing things outside that they couldn't have unless their spirits had left their body and flew around. None of these stories have ever been substantiated. Every story of NDEs that seem to showcase an impossible out-of-body experience are stories relayed by apologists who have a vested interest in establishing NDEs as a supernatural experience, telling stories that they heard from other apologists about secondhand hearsay accounts of some unidentified patient who allegedly said they saw something spooky while flatlined. It's an I want to believe this is real game of telephone where a person might wake up from a coma saying they vaguely recall hearing their family around them in the hospital while they were in the coma, and then that story gets embellished more and more with each believer it passes through, until it morphs into something like they were clinically brain dead and yet they floated out of their body and into another wing of the hospital where they heard 5 new mothers naming their babies. And then when they woke up, they correctly identified all 5 of those babies by name. There's nothing there but fanciful stories backed up by nothing, rumor, conjecture, and hearsay accounts. Then, of course, there is the little problematic nugget of there being far more likely explanations than anything supernatural to explain NDEs. A person in a coma or near-death state still have some brain function and thus still able to process external sensory stimuli on some level, like hearing things being said in the operating room, or vague flashes of light, or seeing things during fleeting moments when their eyes opened and closed. These sorts of things being processed by the brain and experienced as dreamlike memories or visions when the person's finally revived. Or, of course, stories of floating down a tunnel of light and seeing dead loved ones at the end of it, waving them towards a heaven. Well, these are easily explained as a dream of dying that's culturally imposed by the stories that we've all heard all of our lives about what it's like when people die. Sure, these explanations aren't near as fanciful and emotionally moving as the idea of a real supernatural experience, but they're far more likely. Furthermore, there's also the rarely talked about fact that NDEs are in no way evidence for any kind of a god. I mean, let's say we give NDEs every concession possible. Let's say people do have spirits that do leave their bodies and do float around, able to see without eyes, able to hear without ears, to perceive without a functioning brain to do so. And let's say they float off into an ethereal afterlife on another plane of existence. The reality of the situation is that none of that proves any kind of a god. That would prove spirits. That would prove separated consciousness. That would prove an afterlife. But it absolutely would not prove any god. Proof of a god is proof of a god. People like to sometimes pretend that proving things that aren't God will actually prove God, based entirely on the idea that such and such supernatural thing couldn't exist were it not for a God making it so. Except that is an assumption based on little more than the fact that religion typically links those two things. Soul/afterlife equals God. And because of that common association, the religious-minded often think that if they prove souls, that will automatically prove God. But that's not how it works. If you prove souls, if you prove an afterlife, all you've proven is souls and an afterlife. It could actually be that those things exist without an all-powerful supreme being controlling them. So NDEs, even if proven entirely true, still doesn't get you any closer to proving any god. But we don't even have to give NDEs all of that consideration because they're laughably silly stories with absolutely nothing to substantiate them. So, yeah, I can totally get why almost none of the apologists went with this particular load of tripe.
Trent Horn, a Catholic apologist, was the only one who said contingency. Now, this is a kind of causological argument, but it moves from the existence of contingent things, like the universe, that didn't have to exist, as saying the best explanation for its existence is a necessary being.
I've dealt with contingency arguments till I'm blue in the face. The shorthand refutation is that it relies on a lot of linguistic tricks. I mean, why is the universe classified automatically as a contingent thing? Why do you claim that the universe didn't have to exist? Says who? As far as I'm aware, the universe did have to exist, because it does exist. And anything that does exist can't not exist. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, only changed. That's a basic core principle of physics. Meaning that all the matter in the universe has to exist. What form it exists as is open to discussion, but it does have to exist. Meaning that the universe is not contingent. It is necessary. Meaning that it doesn't need a necessary being for it to be contingent on. That's one problem with the lingo they use for this argument. Another is the whole necessary being thing. They like to slip that one in unexplained. Actual contingency arguments only argue for something necessary from which all contingent things flow. It says nothing about the necessary thing needing to be a being. Nothing about it having to be a willful, intelligent, all-powerful entity. In fact, real contingency arguments say nothing whatsoever about the nature of that necessary thing. Only that it is necessary. Which is why real contingency arguments could end up pointing to something like a multiverse, or a creative process of natural, universal formation by interaction of necessary cosmic forces, all of them being unintelligent and unguided. Or, again, just the universe itself being that contingent thing. Apologists like to try to use contingency arguments and slip in the whole all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God being stuff when you're not looking, and then if you catch them and call them out on it and say, excuse me, where are you getting all of those God aspects for your necessary thing from? Well, then they'll just scoff with incredulity and go, well, God, it just has to be. I mean, that just makes logical sense. It has to be. Yeah, contingency arguments suck.
It big time sucks ass.
Now, two people, Mary Jo Sharp and Ruslan KD, said the argument from reason. And there's different versions of this that C.S. Lewis and Alvin Plantinga gave, but it's basically a move from the reliability of our cognitive faculties to understand truth in the world to the best explanation being not some naturalistic blind process, but that we were built to understand truth in a certain fashion.
Now, I find the simplest explanation is the best.
You think the best explanation for our cognitive capacity for thought and reason is that the most complex being imaginable, a being of all power, all knowledge, everywhere all at once, a mind without a brain to produce it, a being without a body to house it, outside of all time and all space, the Alpha and the Omega, created our ability to reason magically out of nothing? That is a better explanation than that we evolved greater cognitive complexity because it was advantageous for us to do so until we reached a level of cognition that included thought and reason? No, I think what you actually mean to say there is that understanding evolution, and specifically our mental development, is difficult and requires understanding a lot of science, and that it's much easier to just think of it as being the result of a magic spell cast by a magic ghost who did everything that is hard to understand through magic. But magic, while it may be an easier explanation to wrap your head around, is not actually a viable explanation at all. It's an abdication of explaining. It's a placeholder for an actual explanation. Because magic explains nothing. Saying God did it explains nothing. It's much more difficult to wrap one's head around an actual explanation for human reasoning. But we do know how it happened. The evolution of human reasoning is a complex and gradual process closely tied to the tripling of brain size in the Homo lineage and the emergence of complex social and technological challenges. It was not a single event, but an accumulation of cognitive abilities shaped by natural selection, with several key factors driving its development. For instance, the need to manipulate the environment for survival favored the evolution of causal reasoning, which is the ability to understand cause and effect, which is fundamental for developing technological know-how. This allowed for general problem solving and simple tool use. Also, there's the idea that human reasoning evolved to improve communication and social interaction rather than just for solitary decision-making. Producing better arguments helps individuals convince others of their ideas, coordinate their actions, and justify their decisions within a social group. This is a crucial element of survival in highly interdependent social structures like humans have developed. Also, the emergence of language provided a massive boost to reasoning by allowing the efficient communication of complex knowledge and abstract thoughts across generations, multiplying the benefit of individual know-how. Now, these are all steps that added to the enhancement of human cognition and our ability to reason. And all of these things, as well as many more that added to the reason that we developed the ability to reason, are all things that we know happened, that we know exists and have impacts on how we think and process data. But again, it takes a lot to understand them all. It's the intersection of history, biology, anthropology, evolutionary psychology, sociology, neurology, and a dozen other ologies to get a firm understanding of the millennia-long process of developing gradually the human capacity for reason and complex thought. Or one could simply say God did it and shut their brain off thereafter. Well, I don't care how much easier and more comfortable it is for you to just shut down your ability to reason with the thought-terminating flotsam that is the notion that God gave us the ability to think, and that's the best explanation for it. It's not even a viable explanation. It's just you not wanting to think about it that much. In this case, the best explanation isn't the one that is easiest for you. The best explanation is the one that actually explains things, and that we have ample evidence for being the case. The fact that thinking about it gives you a headache is utterly immaterial to the reality of the situation.
Now, the third category, this was given by 15 apologists that I asked, and this is basically the evidence for Jesus. So this could be the life, the teachings, the impact, or the miracles of Jesus. They consider the best evidence for God.
And this goes to show the intellectual bankruptcy of the common Christian apologist. Where does 100% of the supposed evidence for the life, teaching, impact, and miracles of Jesus come from? That's right. Comes from the Bible. And what do we always say when the Bible is attempted to be used? Even if they try to bring up other lines of supposed evidence for Jesus, like the writings of Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, and claim that, hey, they talked about Jesus too, and they weren't Christians, well, yeah, they were historians. Basically, they were the record keepers of their time who wrote about the Christians that existed and what those Christians believed. They did not write about anything they actually saw, nor did they record any first-hand experiences of Jesus. I mean, it would be like if I wrote about Bigfoot believers today and what they believe about Bigfoot existing, even though I don't think that at all. But then 2,000 years from now, historians were to dig up my writings and say, hey, see this Professor Plink guy? Well, he wrote about the existence of Bigfoot, even though he didn't follow Bigfoot himself. Therefore, Bigfoot must have been real. No, the only historical evidence is some sketchy historical indications that there was a faith leader in that part of the world at the time called Jesus. But any notions of miracles that he performed, or him being the son of any kind of god, or resurrecting from the dead, or fulfilling any prophecies that are all claimed in the Bible, well, they only come from the Bible. And it should go without saying that you can't use a claim to prove a claim. The Bible is the claim. And as such, anything in the Bible cannot be used to prove the Bible.
Cannot believe I have to explain this to you.
The next category is the moral argument. There's different versions of the moral argument, but it's basically a move from the existence of objective morality that we all know and see and expect others to follow, to the best explanation being a moral law giver.
Quick aside, is anyone else consistently put off by Sean's tendency to slow down his speech as he reaches the end of a sentence in what seems a very condescending manner? I mean, why can't he just say, the best explanation for objective morality is a moral law giver? Instead, he sounds like he's constantly talking down to everyone when he says, the best explanation for objective morality is a moral law giver. Yeah, we speak English, Sean. You don't have to slow down and let each word linger, as if we need extra time to understand what you are saying. I've done a video on this before. This is basically pastor speak. It's a linguistic trick that clergy regularly use to attempt to give extra emphasis and gravitas to their point by slowing down their speech and highlighting the specific words that they want people to focus on. And it can be effective against unsuspecting rubes, but when you're wise to what's being done, it comes across as deceitful and manipulative, attempting to use a linguistic trick to be impactful rather than letting your words and reasoning stand on their own. But I digress. So, moral argument is dumb as shit. Or sorry, I should say, the moral argument is dumb as shit. It hinges on there being objective morality in the first place. And this is something that apologists using this argument will never establish. They usually won't even make an attempt to do so, but instead will just fly right by that sticking point as quickly as they can, as Sean did here, when he explained it as a move from the existence of objective morality that we all know and see and expect others to follow, to the best explanation being a moral lawgiver. I'm also pretty sure he didn't need that comma after explanation, but I'm not the grammar police. But yeah, oh, you're just going to assert that objective morality exists and that everybody knows it, thereby needing no justification because, hey, everybody knows it. Well, I don't know it, Sean. The whole academic pursuit of philosophy itself doesn't know it, which is why the area of philosophy exists at all. Because there's no consensus on right and wrong, or what is true or just, or what ought to be done versus not be done. I've said it before, objective morality is an impossibility, and it's just a pure misunderstanding of what the words mean. All morality is based on value judgments. What is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, it's all value judgments. And all value judgments are subjective because they require a subject to interpret value and assign it. Therefore, all morality is inherently and inextricably subjective. Even if your God exists and has written moral law, that law is still subjective because God would be the subject interpreting and assigning value. So you aren't even arguing for the existence of true objective morality, you're arguing for subjective, God-derived morality. With the only reason why such God-derived morality ought be followed is the tautological notion that God's rules should be followed because he's God. At best, it's a might makes right argument that if you don't follow God's rules, you'll get forever punished in hell. But none of that dispels the notion of either no God existing at all, thus all supposed God-derived morality is just the creation of men thousands of years ago, attempting to establish a religion from which they can control a population, nor does it dispel the idea that even if a God does exist and is writing his subjective moral law, that God could be a cruel and capricious God writing a morality that is detrimental to us and ought be ignored if we care about our own social and emotional well-being. But yeah, in short, there is no such thing as objective morality. If there is, you need to prove there is as a starting point. And just asserting that there is and that everybody knows it isn't going to cut it, Sean.
Maybe you should quit while you're ahead.
The number one category, and you could probably know what it is by this point. 52 of the apologists I asked said creation.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Now, some just said creation in general. Some said like the cosmological argument. Some said fine-tuning, the origin of life. But something about creation pointing towards a creator was the number one response.
Well, that's dumb as all hell. Because at the end of the day, it's just another linguistic trick. Referring to the existence of the universe as a creation automatically denotes a creator. But there's no reason to think existence is a creation in the first place. and that the existence of everything could just be a natural occurrence. But let's go through some of the specific lines of theistic reasoning on this idea of creation. And I'm going to try to speed run them because they're largely old hat and have been picked apart before countless times.
So the Kalam cosmological argument points to the beginning of the universe to there being a beginner. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
The Kalam cosmological argument. This is the preferred apologetic of our friend Lobar Bill.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
So, he says, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Except for starters, that isn't even an argument for a god of any kind. It, like the contingency argument, only argues for some kind of contingent cause. It says nothing about the nature of that cause, certainly not saying anything about it being a supernatural god. Plus, all of the premises of this argument are flawed. It is not established that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Quantum physics has, as part of its foundation, the popping into and out of existence of quantum particles, all without apparent causes. Second premise is that the universe began to exist. We do not know that to be the case. We only know that the universe expanded out of an already existing, hot, dense state. There is nothing in science that points to the universe beginning to exist from nothing. So, it is not true that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And it is not true that the universe began to exist. Hence, it cannot be rationally asserted that therefore the universe had a cause. And even if it could, there is not reason to conclude that any presumed cause would be anything like the Christian God.
Fine-tuning points towards certain laws of physics and cosmology that exist within a very narrow range where the slightest change in those numbers would make the universe inhospitable to life. So the fine-tuning seems best explained by a fine-tuner.
There is no fine-tuning to the universe. There is only universal consistency. The constants of the universe have the stable values that they have because they had to have some value. And all indications are that everything in the universe simply conforms to the forces acting upon them. And those forces, especially the fundamental forces like gravity and the nuclear force, being mere brute facts of existence, and it is possible and even likely that they cannot be different from what they are. Meaning that you cannot appeal to the idea of them having been set by a god.
Others would be the origin of life, the amount of DNA you find in a cell, the complexity of information points towards a mind or an author of life.
The fact that DNA is complex, a relative term that only works in comparison to something more simplistic, is only an indication that evolution increases molecular complexity over time, and that roughly 4 billion years of increasing genetic complexity is a long-ass time to allow for something as complex as the human genome to arise. If we met an alien species that had been evolving for twice as long as we have, odds are its genetic material would be significantly more complex than ours. It's not an indication of design. It's an indication of how evolution works, plus a long amount of time.
But I'd love to know what you think. I'm going to put the data in the notes of the 100, it's actually 100 plus apologists. And if you look at it and you see any patterns or things that jump out to you, let me know.
Yeah, Sean, one major thing above and beyond all others jumped out to me.
It's all total bullshit.
So that was Sean McDowell's breakdown of the 100 apologists surveyed and their favorite arguments for the existence of God. And, of course, it was exactly what you would expect it to be. A replay of the greatest hits of Christian apologetics. Or another way of looking at it, throwing everything at the wall in the hopes that something sticks. We had the contingency argument, we had near-death experiences, we had the argument from objective morality, the cosmological argument, the teleological or fine-tuning argument, the argument from human reason, the argument from DNA, the argument from the Bible. I mean, if he had just managed to work in the ontological argument, i.e., I can imagine a God, therefore there must be one, or the transcendental argument, i.e., everything has to have a supernatural grounding or else nothing would exist, because I say so, then he would have pretty much hammered down every major apologetic argument. But, of course, and expectantly, there was absolutely nothing new presented, nor was there even anything old presented in a slightly newish way that might have made it a bit more interesting. Or, sorry, as Sean would say, nothing presented in a slightly newish way that might have made it a bit more interesting. Towards the end of his video, Sean did mention that some of the apologists he surveyed said that the best proof or best argument for God is whatever one resonates with the individual. And so there isn't one argument in particular that's totally convincing. But also the idea that they're taken in totality altogether, all the arguments create a preponderance of arguments and are cumulatively convincing. Well, Sean, what happens when none of the arguments are convincing to even the slightest degree? What if, say, like is true with Flat Earth, despite the fact that there are dozens of lines of argumentation for their conclusion, every single one of those lines is based on poor understanding of science, incredulity, magical pie-in-the-sky thinking, and flat-out irrationality? What if every argument for the existence of God doesn't even move the proverbial needle to the slightest degree towards God belief? It doesn't matter if you have thousands of different arguments for God. If the argumentative value of all of them is 0, then the cumulative weight of those arguments is still 0. If none of the arguments resonate with a person at all, then there is no best or even slightly good argument in favor of God's existence. And in the absolute, utter, and stark absence of any good reason to believe in God, the only reasonable conclusion is not to. And so that is where we'll leave Sean behind and end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise. All that linked below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Salvi Mike, Autumnal Fling, Michael Martin, and Perry Williams 5407. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.